Hi, everyone. It's Jeremy Benamy from Washington, D.C., and I am very, very excited to be joined today by Nick Kristof, who is a man who needs very little introduction, I am sure, to most of you. An opinion columnist for the New York Times who writes about foreign and domestic issues. We are here today to talk a little bit about his recently published memoir called Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life, and I have a wonderful copy here of it. There is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens, and we're going to ask panelists questions. We're going to ask you all if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A feature. We are recording this conversation, and it will be available to rewatch and to share later. So, Nick, we've got to be really scintillating to get people excited to want to circulate this, but further bio on Nick. Not only do you know him from the New York Times, he is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner. He's covered everything in the last 3 to 4 decades in foreign policy, from Tiananmen Square to the Darfur genocide. He has given voice to the voiceless. He has given a space for advocacy for so many important and critical causes. And he has shown us how journalism can be, put to use for advocacy and activism. And I think, we're going to dig into the book today, Nick, and connect some of your life's work to that sense of activism and engagement. And I'm just really thrilled that you're here with us today. And I mean that literally, having now realized that you nearly died in at least one plane crash and several armed incidents. So we're really glad to have you here.
Considering the alternatives, boy, I'm so happy to be with you as well.
Exactly. Well, let's dig right into the book. And it's a wonderful memoir with so many great stories. And of course, every story wraps together with a moral and wraps together with a lesson. But perhaps the central lesson of the book for me does relate to this question of hope. And you've titled the memoir Chasing Hope. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little about the origin of the title and what that concept means to you and to your work.
Yeah, I wanted to frame it in part about hope because I see so much distress, particularly among young people, but not exclusively, about the state of the world, a sense of despair about where we're headed. And I think that all the challenges that they talk about are real, from the threat to democracy at home to obviously wars in the Middle East and in Ukraine, climate change. Those are all real challenges. But I fear that despair is paralyzing and doesn't actually help us address those challenges. Well, what I have seen in my career is that hope is empowering, and some sense of possibility is actually a requisite often to achieving the kind of change that one sees. And, I guess I'd also say that we in the news business are probably part of the reason for that despair, and that we cover all the things that are going wrong. But there is also a lot going on that is right. And we tend to cover events which are mostly bad. We don't as much cover trends, which are often mostly good. Um, and when you're on the front lines, you see warlords doing terrible things, you see genocide, war, but you also see what we humans are capable of in the best sense, the courage, strength that we feel, and that lets me return from these places filled with a certain amount of hope.
And you talked a little bit about how you hope to try to infect others with hope. And you mentioned that that is one of the legacies and the gifts of your dad. And I'm wondering if you could maybe, I loved learning a little bit more about your family. I love the fact that you have roots with William Shakespeare and with, spies in Eastern Europe and the whole, it's quite the family story. But tell us a little bit about your dad and how that infection of hope was passed on.
So my dad's family, they were Armenians living in Eastern Europe in a area called Northern Bukovina, where the flag kept changing. And so my dad tended to identify as Romanian. His brother is Polish. His sister is Armenian. And then the family spied on the Nazis, was part of a spy ring on the Nazis in World War II. They got caught. Some of the family members were executed by the Nazis, others by the communists. And the family fled in every which direction. My dad ended up in a concentration camp in Yugoslavia, and a French diplomat saved his life. And this was not something the French diplomat really should have been doing professionally. And my dad was not a French national. There were no French interests at stake. But this diplomat went out on a limb and did that. There's some indication that the diplomat may have actually paid a price professionally for doing this. And so periodically in my own career, I've thought about where my obligations are to my profession of journalism and questions about staying neutral, et cetera. And those are real, but also about my obligations to people that I've come across. And if I've sometimes gone a little close to the edge, it may be because this French diplomat saved my dad's life, and then other folks sponsored my dad to come to the U.S. in 1952, and that did not solve the global refugee problem, didn't make a dent in it, but it sure made a difference for the Kristofs.
Yeah, no, I was really moved by that story. There's so many stories during World War II of diplomats who broke outside of the rules, and broke outside of the constraints of their office, and the number of lives that they saved, and the stories then of their kids and grandkids, and the gratitude. It's amazing the difference in people's lives, and that work is incredibly unsung, and it's just wonderful to have that story told in the book.
Yeah, and I wish that that I mean, essentially, diplomacy is really about advancing national interests, but it can also be about advancing national values. And in this case, my dad's life was saved by a diplomat who did not help French interests, but he certainly did advance French values. And I exist because of that.
And the concept of hope, I mean, this was also, of course, a very big Obama legacy, right? Is the whole concept of what constitutes hope, and being the hope, right? And being the change, and not simply waiting passively for hope to be imparted, but actually bringing it about and being an active player in it. You write, I think, that hope is not simple-minded hope that we're all going to sing Kumbaya together, but hope based on evidence and tempered by disappointment and pragmatism. And I love that concept. And it's the idea, people often say, are you a optimist or a pessimist? Is the glass half full or half empty? And I just think that's such a passive approach to life, right? The question is, where's the
Right.
pitcher, and how do you fill the glass if you want a full glass of water?
I think of a time I visited Pakistan, and I was in a remote part of the Punjab in a little village, and I came across a man called Mukhtar Mai, who had been sentenced by a village tribunal to be gang raped because of something that her brother did. And Mukhtar was then the village council carried out this order. They gang raped her. And Mukhtar was expected to kill herself out of shame. And instead, she prosecuted her attackers. She sent them to prison. And then she used compensation money to start the first school in the village because she had the hope that education would overcome the kind of attitudes that had led to her gang rape. And then she enrolled the children of her attackers in her school. And you could not come back from that village of Mirwala and not feel that as a testament to hope and the possibilities that it creates.
So as you were curating the stories that you decided to include in the book, what was sort of the process that you went through in your mind? You must have 1,000 stories from all of the different travels and places you've been. How did you choose the anecdotes that you did put into the book and decided to write up and use for a purpose?
Jeremy, that's so painful to have the stories that, there are such good bar stories and you don't tell. But essentially, I was really trying to send some kind of a larger message about the world, about journalism, about, people I've come to respect. And so it was this painful process of winnowing out the ones that maybe were fun stories, fun yarns, but didn't work so well to actually tell a story, to make a larger point.
It seems like the themes of sort of justice and injustice are really absolutely central to you have a very strong moral compass and a very strong sense of justice. And um, you seem to be drawn to places where that is the central feature. Is that, you know, your dad again? Is that, your mom? I mean, what brings that sense of justice to you? Where did that come from in your reporting and as a driving force in your writing?
So I certainly think that both my mom and dad shaped me in that respect, but a lot of it is simply also just the things you see and the outrage you feel. I was on Tiananmen Square on the night of June 3rd to 4th, 1989, when Chinese troops opened fire on the student protesters and on the crowd that I was in. You just don't forget seeing a modern army use weapons of war against unarmed protesters. That left a deep impression on me. And, later I made what I thought was going to be one trip to Darfur to cover what I discovered was a genocide there. I mean, and again, I was, I was with the tribes that were being attacked, and this is a arid area. So people need to get water from wells, and this Janjaweed militia committing the genocide was standing by the wells. If men showed up, the Janjaweed would kill them. If women showed up, they would rape the women. And so these families that I was hiding with, they were sending their very young kids, 9, 10-year-old kids with donkeys, miles across the desert to the wells to get water, because often the Janjaweed did not kill or bother the kids. And, their anxiety, their terror as they waited to see if the kids would come back, that just haunted me. And, I came back and hugged my kids, but I couldn't get that out of my mind. And so I made another trip and another trip, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really been, I think, that experience of seeing injustice that makes me want to fight back with my with my keyboard, with my camera.
So a question that is in the Q&A, but was certainly top of my mind, relates to your brief foray out of the journalism arena into the arena, to use the Teddy Roosevelt concept of getting into the arena. And I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit your thoughts now looking back on your run for governor and what in terms of activism and engagement in the political arena versus journalism, where your head is at today, as you think about that fork in the road.
Oh, it was an amazing experience, and it ended up in a belly flop, and that I was barred from running. But I learned a lot. Essentially, it came because I grew up here in rural Oregon. This is a blue collar area. I'm on the family farm right now, and good jobs went away. Meth arrived, and just disaster followed. At this point, more than a third of the kids on my old number 6 school bus to Yamhill Grade School and Yamhill Carleton High School, more than a third of those kids have died from drugs, alcohol, suicide, and kind of reckless accidents. And it felt that we had failed these kids. And likewise, you couldn't walk through Portland and not feel that this is not the way governance should be. And so I made this leap. It was funny because my team thought, well, Kristof may not know campaign finance, he may not know the local county commissioners, but the one thing he'll be good at is doing interviews and meeting the press. And it turned out one of the things I really flopped at was interviews, because I kept trying to answer questions. My team was like, huh? Why did you try to answer that that question, you need to answer the question that you want to be asked, not the one you were actually asked. And I mean, I learned a lot. I think I started out thinking that politics is fairly dysfunctional. I left feeling that it's even more dysfunctional in the sense that in Oregon, the governor is essentially chosen by a fairly modest number of Democratic primary voters. Uh, Campaign fundraising is something that is critical, and that was something that helped me because I had a lot of donors. But the average donor in a primary, if I remember right, is 67 years old. And that is not somebody, or the median campaign dollar, I think, comes from somebody who's 67 years old. That is not somebody who's likely to be talking about public schools, for example. Um, and also, it was a little bit hard because, I'd always been paid to be provocative and to speak my mind. And as a candidate and as a politician, you are pressed to speak in platitudes and not be provocative. Um, I would in Portland, I'd be meeting Democratic donors, and we'd be talking about the problems in Portland, and I sometimes feel people wanted me to say how awful Republicans were, and I think Republicans have screwed up in so many places, so many times, but I kept thinking, in Portland, we can't blame the mess in Portland on Republicans because there aren't any Republicans in Portland. This is our mess. We helped create it, and we have to help solve it. And so it was an incredible adventure. I learned a lot. I think it has shaped how I think about politics and maybe how I cover it.
So I just want to note that an old friend of yours in the Q&A sends her regards, someone who else was in politics, Ruth Messenger, who you and I both know from New York politics, but also from American Jewish World Service and her work in Darfur around the world. So she sends
She,
her.
she did heroic work in so many places around the world. Ruth is truly a gem.
Yep. No, it's terrific to have you with us, Ruth. So, one of the things that I noted also in your book and, in journalism and writing, the communications obviously is the centerpiece of everything, getting your message across. And you really hit on a huge problem that liberals and the Democratic Party and the coastal elites have, which is this failure to communicate with the center of the country. And it seems that, given your childhood, given the community that you know so well, you really have an ability to understand that and to understand the gap. And then you go off to Harvard and you go off to the Rhodes Scholarship and you're in this bubble at the New York Times, with all these folks who are from that world. What have you had any traction and any success in trying to help bridge that gap between the real world, where 1 out of 3 of your school bus mates is suffering the way that they are, and the sort of ivory tower elite bubble that sort of liberal elites move in?
So I have a lot of, very dear friends who see the world very differently than I do and, don't buy into my liberalism at all. But we care about each other. We can talk about politics and other issues. And I'm frustrated by them when they refuse to get vaccinated for COVID, or when they think this is all some, plot by Bill Gates to monetize the vaccine or whatever they may think. And they're frustrated by me when I favor, gun safety policies or various other things. But I do think that there are paths forward. I think that in my kind of liberal educated world, there is way too much condescension to working class Americans. And I think it's really hard to win votes in support of people that one is condescending to. I think we can use a lot more listening to people around the country and understanding of their challenges, a little less finger pointing and more offering hands. And if you think, like, there are few issues that are more toxic in America right now. Well, actually, maybe the Middle East is one, but I was thinking gun
We'll get to
policy
that.
is, gun policy, Middle East, it's both pretty toxic. And my neighbors here in rural Oregon I don't think they care so much about the Middle East, but they do care about guns. And I'm on the other side of that issue from them. But I do find that I can have a conversation with them about these issues. And what it involves is not talking at 30,000 feet about the kind of the big issues, but complexifying the issue. So instead of talking about the Second Amendment, I say, well, we all recognize that somebody with a felony conviction can't buy a firearm, but what about somebody with a violent misdemeanor conviction in the last 3 years? What maybe that person shouldn't be able to buy one too, and they're willing to think about that. And then they press me on some issue where I'm prone to wavering, or I say, okay, that everybody understands that there should be a minimum age to buy a handgun. In Oregon, it's 18, but in Wyoming, very pro-gun state, is 21. Maybe we should raise the age to buy a handgun to 21, same as Wyoming. And again, people are willing to have that conversation at the edges. It opens a channel of discussion of a certain amount of civility and respect. And I think we can do that in other areas too. But it does mean listening to people with whom we really disagree.
So that leads me into a line of questioning that relates to journalism today and the newsroom today, and some of the changes you've seen over the course of 3 or 4 decades in the politics of the newsroom, and those are politics that affect all of our workplaces and all of the different types of environments that we're in. You talk a little bit about the story of James Bennett, who was the op-ed page editor, who ended up losing his job. And part of the issue there is the willingness of people to listen to people that they don't necessarily agree with. And perhaps you might share, a little bit with folks your take on where the newsroom and the journalism today stands in terms of the ability to hear views from the other side and the ability to actually, facilitate some of this dialogue as opposed to really just pushing into their own corners.
Yeah, and I find myself in a kind of a strangely conflicted situation because for most of my career, I was one of the advocates who said that journalism should have a moral purpose and that the issues, the choices we make and what we cover, how we write about them, they reflect some kind of a moral code. And that journalism is important partly because it is connected to a cause larger than quarterly profits. And I do deeply believe that, but I also think that has to be tethered to a humility about, how often we manage to get it wrong and how hard it is to know exactly where the truth is. And in recent years, and maybe I think it's been particularly visible since the George Floyd episode, there have been a lot of young people in newsrooms who are strongly against platforming, for example, people who they regard as projecting, opinions that are not just wrong, but are immoral and that undermine the public good. And I think we all recognize that, there are limits in the views that should be platformed, and we wouldn't want to, platform some extremist who's going to sow hatred. On the other hand, I tend to believe that we should platform a pretty wide variety of people. And I think that my liberal opinions will actually have more sway and impact if they are periodically escorted by conservative opinions with which I very much disagree. And I think it's important for my views to be challenged by people on the right, on on the Middle East. I think I'm right, but my colleague Brett Stevens takes a very different view. And I think, I learn from his columns. I disagree with them often, but he's a smart guy. And I think that readers are better off, reading my column and his column. And so I've been concerned that a lot of young folks in journalism have been trying to take the moral purpose thing, from my point of view, a little bit too far and deplatform uh, conservative views that I think absolutely we should be exposed to.
So I've managed to go for 26 minutes without mentioning Israel and Gaza. So I guess that probably has now come to an end. And so we're going to dive in there to the deep end. This is obviously an issue that has not avoided your radar screen, but it also hasn't been the centerpiece of your career. And you were never posted in the Middle East. Is that correct?
That's correct. Although I did study Arabic for a year at the American University in Cairo right before joining the Times.
Right, right. And but in terms of your journalism career, it's not necessarily been,
That's correct.
the
Yeah,
centerpiece, but certainly in recent months, there's no way to avoid it. And you have taken some very deep dives into this. And there's a nice question in the Q&A that says, essentially, if you were president, what would you do about the war in Gaza? I thought that was a good, general opening question for you. But curious if you want to share with folks sort of where your thinking is at. You had a wonderful column, I think it was on Friday, about the Biden administration and the failures of its policies and some of the things it could try doing. But maybe you could take a crack at
sure.
answering that question. What would you do?
So, I mean, my starting point is that after October 7th, that Israel had every right to respond militarily, and indeed something of an obligation to, because I think it was important to try to reestablish deterrence. But response, I think too often people think of it as a binary choice of attack or don't attack. And it's not, it's a spectrum. And from my point of view, that spectrum, the Israeli military response needed to be dialed way, way, way back. And it needed to focus on Hamas leaders and certainly not to bar transfers of food and humanitarian goods across the border. And I think that has been counterproductive for Israel. I think that has probably supported Hamas's aims. And so I wish that President Biden had been much more attentive very, very early on to try to get Israel to dial back that response. And when Netanyahu did not listen to him, then I think he needed to use leverage. And that leverage was the transfer of offensive military weapons to Israel. So I wish that he had done that much, much earlier on uh, to try to restrain Netanyahu. And this would have, I mean, this would have been an imperfect solution, and it would have meant fewer Hamas militants killed. I think it. I don't think that Israel is going to eradicate Hamas, and it would have been even less likely to if it took a more restrained view. So, I mean, there would have been real cost to this. On the other hand, I think Israel would have had much more international support. There would have been many, many fewer people killed. And, at the end of the day, I'm a deep believer in a two-state solution. I think that that's the only way to secure Israel in the long run. I think right now, neither side has a partner for peace in the other. Um, I'm I don't have much confidence in the Palestinian Authority right now. I I would like to see President Biden put pressure on Israel to release Marwan Barghouti as one of the people who I don't know if Barghouti could lead Palestinians toward a two-state solution, but I think he might be able to, and I don't see a lot of other people in the PA leadership who might be able to do that. And I think it would be a mistake if Barghouti were released as part of a Hamas deal that would credit Hamas. I'd much rather that it just be done independently. So, you know, I I think President Biden is in a bind. I criticize him for not putting enough pressure on Israel. Other people criticize him for putting too much pressure. But at the end of the day, it's hard to look at what has happened over the last 7 months and more and see that this has been successful either practically or morally or politically.
At some point earlier in the year, you wrote about um, Mohammed al-Shanat and gave a harrowing description of, his text chains, and it seemed that the communication ran out in March. Have you heard anything
I
from?
I just got an email today, and from him after a long gap. I was I was afraid about what had happened to him, and uh, he but he's alive. His so Muhammad al-Shanad, he's a
Tell us the story.
yeah. So this is he's a scholar. He's a PhD student, a linguistics professor. His field is linguistics. He's this peaceful guy with a wife and two kids. He had written, long before October 7th about the importance of Jews and Arabs living together in peace. And then he was caught up in the war. He was starving. His son was injured in the leg. I connected him to an American doctor, a orthopedic surgeon who was there. And so he, like, into the message today, he says that every day we say it can't get worse than it does. The war has restarted together with more vigor. I'm concerned about my injured son. The area we fled to has no toilets. He can't bend because of his injury and keeps defecating himself. This causes him a great deal of embarrassment. He keeps crying, refuses to speak, and wraps himself in a blanket. He has lost his dignity and started to develop self-harm thoughts. Please keep praying for us. And this is one gentle scholar just trying to keep himself and his wife and his kids alive in the middle of this war. He is not Hamas. He is the kind of person who could provide much more civil leadership in Gaza, and instead he's being brutalized.
And I think in the chat that Eliza has put a link not only to the column with the texts from Muhammad, I think also your recent column, and most importantly, a link to the book, which people should, of course, check out and consider buying. So all of that is in the chat, and we continue to take questions in the Q&A. And we come back to the question of hope. Curious in the context of what is happening in Gaza and what appears to be just a never ending. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a pathway out of this right now. Where do you find the hope in that, and what do you see as the source for those of us who are continuing to work on this? And many of the people in today's chat with us and listening in are part of J Street, and we're in this because we're trying to create that hope. So I'm curious what you would look to for us in this kind of work, in this situation, to be that motivator of hope.
Frankly, I think it's pretty hard to find hope right now in the Middle East. And President Biden, has his plan for a temporary ceasefire that leads to a more permanent one, and then a three-way Israel, Saudi Arabia, American deal. I think that's not impossible, but I think it's probably pretty unlikely. But there was a great Chinese writer, Lu Xun, who wrote that hope is like a path in the countryside. At first, there is nothing. And then because people walk this way again and again, a path appears. And I kind of think, that is what I've seen, that when I first began to cover the Northern Ireland mess, it was pretty much impossible to imagine something emerging out of that. Same with the Basque terrorism in Spain. And I have a hard time seeing how exactly the things are sorted out. But in after the 1973 war, it was pretty hard to see how there was going to be any kind of advances in peace, and yet, strangely, unpredictably, that did lead to the Sadat visit and the landmark Egyptian-Israeli peace. So I think it is going to involve people walking this way again and again until a path appears. And I think I mean, I don't see any alternative to a two-state solution. Um, I just, Israel has been so traumatized that I think it's hard to see Israelis making the concessions necessary. I think that Palestinians are incredibly traumatized and have felt that that this hasn't worked for them. I think they're skeptical. I think extremists on both sides have empowered extremists on the other. And, it, after all, and one reason why Netanyahu uh, first won the prime minister's job was the Hamas attacks back in the 90s. And I think that each side each side has ended up supporting the other in a way that is completely tragic.
One of the things you are pointing to is the need for leadership, and the Sadat visit to Jerusalem in the wake of the Yom Kippur War was simply a game changer, historical moment. And you've had a lot of exposure to people in leadership roles in various different settings, and I'm curious what your takeaway is about the attributes of a good leader, and what does one want to look for in candidates for office, and as we're trying to decide on our own choice for leaders, what do you think makes for a good leader in these types of difficult situations?
I think that vision and the capacity to communicate so that others are drawn toward that vision are absolutely central. And um, and that strong moral compass that I think is crucial for any navigator, whether in politics or anywhere else. I've got to say that particular policy stances obviously always also matter to me. And I really admired John McCain in many, many ways. He was one of the most remarkable politicians I've ever seen in my career. And the courage he showed when he was running for president and was rebuking his followers for their attacks on Obama. I mean, that was just one of the most magnificent moments I've seen in American political history. And yet, I didn't vote for McCain because I preferred Obama. Uh, but that sense, to me, when I have seen leaders who have really changed the field, it has been above all because of that vision and the ability to unite people behind that vision and then institutionalize it again as much through communications ability as anything else. Do you
Looking through,
agree? You've seen a lot of leaders over the years. What do you think?
I think that communication is absolutely key. The ability to convey those ideas. Now that obviously can be used for ill and for good, right? That's the danger.
Absolutely.
You do have
Absolutely.
that the moral compass decides, where you're headed, right? But nobody's going to follow if the leader isn't able to get across to the audience of the public what it is that they're trying to do on their behalf. The empathy. Look at Clinton. Look at Obama, Biden. The three of them who I've worked closely with. I think the empathy factor is really important, and being able to then understand what does the audience want to hear from me. I can feel your pain, right? That was the Clinton line.
Yeah.
And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about your, in a sense, it's a bit of a rebuke to some of the liberal elites, and the inability to feel the pain of the middle of the country, and to feel the pain of your community, and to feel the pain of the communities whose votes they're losing to a man who has no empathy, right? Who was born without that, it appears, and just knows anger and retribution and not empathy.
It's been very frustrating to me to see my community respond to somebody I enormously disapprove of, Donald Trump. And about two-thirds of voters in my precinct voted for Trump. But I think that's partly because they felt that Trump was speaking to them, and he was talking about bringing the factories back, and he was pointing to scapegoats, and they felt that he understood their pain. One of my friends who is a strong Trump supporter. This is a woman who was my seventh grade crush, and somebody who, she was homeless 7 years. She then was kind of brought out by a local church, and I think she feels that Democrats often are scornful of people of faith, maybe not entirely wrongly. And she She lost four family members to suicide. She at one point put a gun to her head. And so then she heard Trump talking about how he was going to get those jobs back. And she finally somebody speaking to me. And, from my point of view, Trump is a charlatan and a demagogue, but he was speaking to Mary. And I wish other Democrats tried harder to speak to Mary.
Yeah, I mean, the snake oil salesman metaphor, the reason the salesman succeeded is they knew what the potential customer wanted to buy, right? And then they
That's right.
packaged it and they sold it. And that was not based on what it was they were selling. It was based on what the consumer wanted to buy. And that's the whole point of communications, right? It's not about what you want to say. Now, journalism, you may have a different experience in journalism, but in political communications, it's about what your audience is able to and wants to and needs to hear. And that's what you need to frame your message around.
But I do think that, look, if the topic is immigration, then, my neighbors are all going to vote conservative. If, there are many, many issues on which they lean right. But if the topic is the minimum wage, then they are all in with Democrats. If it is access to health care, to some extent, even various populist things, raising taxes on billionaires, I think they'd be happy with uh, child care, maybe as well. So I do think that, Democrats have some messages that can resonate if they can avoid coming across as condescending and disrespectful of faith, this kind of thing.
Right. And I think that, it just is again a fascinating theme throughout the book, in terms of trying to bridge that gap. And you have lived a life in which you've moved through these circles where there is a commonality among the people that you're moving in those circles with, and they share background and education and all of that, but they're talking about problems that affect other people, and they don't understand it themselves, and they don't take the time often to go out and actually sit with people and understand where people are coming from so they can then communicate to them.
It always sort of puzzled me that, when I was writing about Afghanistan, that there was a real intellectual interest on the part of my world of liberals in militant Islam and where it was coming from, this kind of thing. And I think that there's been less interest in, if you will, militant evangelicalism in this country. And, in fact, I have seen on issues like human trafficking, it was possible for liberal feminists to work closely with conservative evangelicals on approaches that really crack down on pimps and reduce the trafficking of girls in this country and abroad. So there are times when we can move forward with a big tent with people we disagree with profoundly. Um, and I wish that there were more of that.
Yeah, one of the things we try to do with J Street is to try to focus on the solution and the future, and avoid the blame game and
Right.
arguments over history, because you're never going to solve those, and who's the bigger victim, and whose side suffered more from whatever. If you're focused on the future, you can find something in common. You can find a way to try to build a better future. And I think that solutions focus and that focus on the future is a really important part of that as well.
I think that is such a wise approach. I mean, I've covered a lot of really painful, difficult, toxic issues, but I think that Gaza post October 7th is kind of takes the cake. And there's just, so many folks who were just shattered, on both sides, just vehement. And I think that makes it really hard to try to map a path forward to address the needs of either Gazans or Israelis.
I'm looking at some of the recent questions that pick up on our conversation about your friend, your neighbors, and the question of whether or not the failure of the Trump years to bring back the manufacturing and to actually deliver, or the successes that the Biden administration has achieved, at least legislatively, does any of that actual stuff that goes on in Congress and Washington and, in the policy sense, does that have an impact on people's lives? Are they changing their perceptions, or is that sort of happening over people's heads and it doesn't really impact their lives on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, it has had much less resonance than I wish it did. I mean, from, my point of view, Trump messed up in every almost every possible way in managing the pandemic and managing a bunch of other issues. And that, Biden has, I mean, in a rural America, in a place like this, bandwidth in rural areas is incredibly important. My community was transformed by FDR's rural electrification, and what Biden is trying to do in bringing broadband to rural communities is kind of a modern version of that. It's so powerful, and that is happening. And there are, the CHIPS Act is going to create some jobs, but I don't think he's gotten as much credit for it as he deserves. And I don't think that Trump got as much blame for it as he deserved at the time. Um, and, I think that partly has to do with communication skill and partly to do with the way we in the press tend to cover controversies rather than what is actually happening at grassroots.
In another series of questions in the Q&A has to do with the November election, and there's just a burning concern in the J Street world. It's reflected here, but you probably hear this a lot as well, which is that there's this group of younger voters that at the end of the day is going to just stay home because they can't stomach voting for Biden, and that Gaza and the whole, war and support for Israel is going to be a piece of that. What are you seeing and what are you hearing in your reporting and being out and about in the country right now? Are you worried about that as well?
I'm absolutely worried about that. And, I tend to see things to some degree from international perspective. And it's not just Biden who is unpopular, around the world, the prime minister from, Japan to Britain to France, they're all enormously unpopular. And part of that is this resentment at what people perceive as elites. In a sense, the system has failed them. And I think that creates an opportunity for a demagogue to come around and say they're going to restore power to ordinary people. And it's not an accident that, in Italy, we have Giorgia Meloni, somebody with a party that has kind of neo-fascist roots, who is one of the most popular leaders in Europe right now over those who are more steadfast. And when I see the Netherlands, those calm, sober Dutch ending up supporting somebody like Geert Wilders, I think, boy, what hope is there for America? But I also do think that Trump is a particularly weak candidate, and weaker than some of the others in other countries. And it's a long way till election day. I think when people focus on him, especially if he has a criminal conviction, I think that will hurt him at the margin. Um, I hope, look, I've been very critical of Biden over Gaza, but a little nervously because, at the end of the day, Trump would be, I think, substantially worse. Um, and I hope that young voters who are very upset by Biden's policy on Gaza will understand that this is not a referendum, but a choice, and that Trump would be would be a lot worse for the issues that they most care about.
Yeah, and they should also pay attention to Trump's warning this weekend that he plans to deport the protesters, right? That was also a clear signal about what the future holds if you are not happy with what he's doing. It's much better to be unhappy under Biden than to be deported under Trump. So that's
Yeah,
a
and one of the things that I worry about in particular that I don't think is got, and there's a lot of talk about threats to democracy, but one aspect of that that I think about is the risk of political violence, and I fear that that could be accentuated by a jury system in which even if somebody is arrested and prosecuted for some kind of a political assassination, we may well be so polarized that there will always be one or two people on that jury who will refuse to convict. And that can create impunity for acts of political violence that then encourage other acts, and it can become self-replicating. And I've seen the way political violence can flow from extremism and in turn amplify it in turn. We're not immune to that.
Yeah. Well, let me give you a chance to close out our conversation, returning back to the theme of chasing hope. And we weren't able to identify the clearest sign of hope necessarily in terms of the Middle East, but I'd love your sort of charge to the group here. In terms of our engagement, what we can be doing. It's not just a Middle East question, but really in terms of our democracy and our engagement. What do you think we all who are concerned about the arc of the moral universe, what should we be doing in these next 4 or 5 months in particular to give us that hope and to put us on the path that we need?
So I guess I would note, Archbishop Desmond Tutu was somebody that I really admired. I worked with him on some issues, and he always spoke about how he was able to overcome apartheid and brutal homophobia in South Africa, brutal xenophobia there, just these impossible odds, because he did cherish that sense of hope of some possibility of doing that. And he certainly wasn't aware exactly how that was going to happen, but he did understand that when things are immoral, that at some point there is going to be pressure to bring about change. And I think that we should, feel fortified by what he and Mandela did in South Africa, by what happened as said, in the Basque Country in Spain and in Northern Ireland. And we have to figure out how we can make conditions such that that is more likely to happen in the Middle East. And I think that, sooner we can get a ceasefire, the better. I think the sooner we can have better leaders in both the Palestinian territories and in Israel, who will think seriously about this. I think that that we can build trust in the populations. I think all that, those are steps, and even if we don't quite see where the steps go and how they will lead, there is going to be a pathway there, and Israelis are not going to kill all Palestinians, and Palestinians aren't going to kill all Israelis. And at some point, there is going to be peace. Just whether it's going to come in 10 years or 50 years or 500. There's a wonderful Chinese saying, "摸着石头过河," which is that you cross a stream by feeling with your bare feet for each stone, one after the other. And that's, I think, what we need to do with the Middle East. And we need to feel now for the next stone. And I think that's going to be a ceasefire, and then a stone that is going to involve some rebuilding and some kind of a Palestinian Authority presence in Gaza, and better PA leadership, better Israeli leadership. But it's going to be crossing these, finding these stones with our bare feet one by one. And J Street is in a business of that kind of crossing the stream in that way and finding those stones. So thank you for all you do.
Well, thank you to Nick Kristof. And again, please do pick up a copy of this wonderful book. And it's filled with great stories and a great career and a lot of good lessons to be passing on from the work that you've been doing. So thank you for your contributions to journalism, to humankind, and to making the world a more moral and better place. Nick Kristof, all the best.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
All right.